The stars looked different through the observation window of the horizon's edge, but Jake Brennan couldn't quite figure out why. He had been asleep for 50 years, frozen in cryo-sleep like everyone else on the massive colony ship, and his mind still felt foggy from the awakening process. The automated systems had pulled him from his pod right on schedule, just as they were programmed to do every half-century for routine checks. Jake rubbed his eyes and moved slowly toward the main control panel. His muscles stiff and uncooperative after decades of inactivity, the ship was quiet in a way that felt wrong. Jake had been through this awakening procedure twice before during the 300-year journey, and each time there had been the steady hum of engines, the soft beeping of navigation computers, and the gentle vibration of a vessel moving through deep space at tremendous speeds. Now there was something else, a slight shudder that ran through the floor plates every few minutes, and the engine noise seemed irregular and strained. Jake reached the main console and began running diagnostics. His training as the ship's military commander had prepared him for various emergencies, though he had never expected to face any real trouble. The horizon's edge was supposed to be on a peaceful mission, carrying 50,000 sleeping humans to a new world far from Earth. They had left behind a crowded planet in search of fresh opportunities, new land, and the chance to build something different. The ship was enormous, nearly 2 miles long, filled with cryopods, supplies, equipment, and everything needed to start a new civilization. The diagnostic screen lit up with red warning indicators. Jake's heart began to beat faster as he scanned through the data. The navigation array was damaged, showing massive gaps in its sensor grid. The outer hull had taken impacts from some kind of energy weapon, and the ship's course had drifted nearly 40 degrees off the planned trajectory. They were no longer heading toward their destination. Jake moved quickly now, his training taking over despite his groggy state. He accessed the external camera feeds and felt his blood run cold. The space around the ship was wrong. The star patterns were unfamiliar, and in the distance he could see structures that definitely weren't natural. Massive stations hung in the void, covered in strange angular architecture and pulsing with dim red lights. This wasn't empty space. This was someone's territory. He needed help. Jake initiated the emergency wake sequence for 2 specific pods, choosing carefully based on what the situation required. The ship's chief engineer, Lisa Monroe, would need to assess the damage and get them moving again. The science officer, Kevin Park, could figure out where they were and what had happened. Jake watched the cryo bay monitors as the 2 pods began their warming cycles, then turned back to the communication systems. The ship's receivers were still functional, and Jake began scanning for any signals in the area. What he found made his stomach sink. The channels were full of transmissions in languages he didn't recognize, but the computer's translation software began working on them immediately. As the program analyzed the alien speech patterns, fragments of meaning started appearing on his screen. Surrender, obey, serve, death, empire. The words were harsh and full of threat. Jake kept scanning, finding more and more transmissions, all carrying the same brutal tone. Whatever civilization controlled this region of space, they were not friendly. He found references to something called the Krelith, mentioned over and over with what the translation software interpreted as fear and submission from some voices, and cruel authority from others. Lisa arrived first, stumbling into the command center with her dark hair still damp from the cryogel. She looked confused and concerned, responding to the emergency wake without knowing what had triggered it. Jake pointed at the damage reports and watched her face go pale as she absorbed the information. Kevin appeared moments later, a thin man with sharp eyes that immediately began scanning the unfamiliar star patterns on the navigation display. Jake explained what he had found. They were off course, badly damaged, and drifting through space controlled by what appeared to be a hostile alien empire. The ship had been attacked while they slept, though the automated systems had somehow managed to limp away from immediate danger. Now they were alone, vulnerable, and very far from home. Lisa began tracing the damage patterns on her console, her fingers moving rapidly across the controls. She determined that the weapon impacts had come from behind the ship, as if something had been chasing them. The automated evasion systems had kicked in, probably saving their lives, but the damage was severe. She estimated it would take 48 hours to repair the navigation systems enough to plot a new course. And even then, they would be running at reduced power. Kevin was equally troubled by what he found. According to the star charts and the positioning data he could extract from their damaged sensors, they had drifted into a region of space that wasn't even mapped in their databases. Earth had sent out probe ships before the horizon's edge departed, but none had come this far. Whatever was out here, humanity had never encountered it before. Jake made them focus on the most immediate problem. He played some of the intercepted communications through the speakers, letting the translation software do its best to convert the alien languages into something they could understand. The picture that emerged was terrifying. The Krellith Empire ruled this entire sector of space with absolute brutality. They had conquered dozens of other species, enslaving some and wiping out others completely. Any ship that entered their territory without permission was seized, its crew either killed or taken as slaves. Lisa asked the obvious question that was on all their minds. Had the Krellith detected them yet? Kevin checked the sensor logs and found the answer they were dreading. A patrol fleet was already moving toward their position, 3 ships on an intercept course. They would arrive in approximately 48 hours. The 3 of them stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of their situation pressing down on them. They were alone, damaged, and about to be caught by an empire that showed no mercy to trespassers. The 50,000 people sleeping in the cryo bays below had no idea that their peaceful journey had turned into something else entirely. Jake stared at the approaching blips on the tactical display. The Krellith ships were moving fast, confident, and unconcerned. They had probably done this 1,000 times before, intercepting vessels that wandered into their space, but they had never intercepted a human ship before, and Jake had no intention of surrendering without a fight. He turned to Lisa and Kevin with a grim expression. They needed to wake more people and prepare for the worst. Jake stood in the cryo bay, watching as more pods began their wake sequences. He had made the difficult choice of who to bring back from their frozen sleep, knowing that each person he woke was one more mouth to feed and one more soul in danger. But they needed fighters, thinkers, and people who could adapt quickly to impossible situations. The first pod to open contained Nicole Sanders, a Marine captain who had served with Jake during the resource wars on Earth before they left. Her eyes snapped open with the clarity of someone trained to wake up ready for combat. The second pod held Peter Vaughn, a xenobiologist who had spent years studying the possibility of alien life before humanity had ever encountered any. His expertise would be crucial now that they were facing actual extraterrestrial beings. The third was Maria Torres, a communications specialist who could work miracles with any kind of signal technology. The fourth was Danny Cole, the best pilot Jake had ever known. Someone who could fly anything with engines and make it dance. Jake briefed them quickly as they recovered from cryosleep, not sugarcoating the situation. They were damaged, outgunned, and about to be intercepted by a hostile alien fleet in less than 2 days. Nicole listened with the cold focus of a soldier assessing a battlefield. Peter looked both terrified and fascinated. Maria immediately asked for access to the communication systems. Danny wanted to know what kind of ships they were up against. Lisa worked frantically in engineering, trying to coax more power from the damaged systems. The Horizon's Edge had never been designed as a warship. It was a colony vessel, built for long-range transport with only basic defensive systems meant to deflect micrometeorites and small debris. The mining lasers on board were powerful enough to cut through asteroids, but they had never been intended to fight military craft. Still, Lisa began running calculations on how to redirect power and weaponize everything they had. Kevin and Peter worked together analyzing the Krellith communications, building a more complete picture of what they were facing. The translation software was getting better with each passing hour as it processed more alien language samples. What they learned was not encouraging. The Krellith were insectoid creatures built like massive armored beetles that stood nearly 8 feet tall. They had evolved on a harsh world where only the strongest survived, and they had carried that brutal philosophy out into space with them. Their empire had been expanding for over 200 years. Crushing every species they encountered, Maria managed to tap directly into the Krelith fleet's tactical communications. A risky move that could reveal their position but gave them invaluable intelligence. She listened through her headset, her face growing more troubled as the translation came through. The Krelith commander was called Warlord Thax, and he was discussing the human ship with his subordinates like they were talking about hunting prey. Thax found it amusing that an unknown species had wandered into his territory. He wanted to capture the ship intact if possible, to study the technology and take the crew as specimens. Danny spent hours in the pilot simulator, studying the limited data they had on Krelith ship movements. He noticed something interesting. The alien vessels moved in rigid formations, following precise patterns that never varied. It suggested a military culture that valued discipline and standard procedures over improvisation. That could be a weakness if they were creative enough to exploit it. Nicole gathered Jake, Lisa, and Danny to discuss their options. Running was impossible with their damaged engines. Hiding was equally pointless since the Krelith already knew where they were. That left fighting, which seemed suicidal given the odds. But Nicole had an idea. The Horizon's Edge was huge compared to normal military vessels. Nearly 2 miles of habitat modules, cargo sections, and industrial equipment. They could use that size to their advantage. Lisa proposed turning the mining drones into improvised missiles. The ship carried hundreds of them, small automated units designed to extract resources from asteroids. If they loaded the drones with volatile fuel and set them on collision courses, they could create a swarm of cheap expendable weapons. Danny suggested venting atmosphere at strategic points to create debris fields that might confuse Krelith sensors. Kevin recommended analyzing the alien ship designs for structural weaknesses they could target. Maria kept monitoring the Krelith communications and provided regular updates on the approaching fleet. 3 warships, each about a quarter the size of the Horizon's Edge, but bristling with weapons and moving at speeds the colony ship could never match. Warlord Thax was confident to the point of arrogance. Treating the intercept as a routine operation rather than a potential battle, the hours ticked away as the crew prepared. Jake authorized the use of emergency protocols to give them access to all the ship's systems. Lisa and her engineering team worked without sleep, modifying mining lasers into something that could punch through military armor. Nicole began planning defensive positions throughout the ship in case the Krelith managed to board them. Peter studied everything they knew about insectoid biology, looking for any vulnerability they could exploit when the Krelith fleet finally arrived. Jake was on the bridge with his small crew watching the tactical display. 3 ships dropped out of faster-than-light travel in perfect formation, their hulls dark and menacing against the stars. They were shaped like elongated teardrops covered in weapon ports and sensor arrays. The lead ship was larger than the other 2. Presumably, Warlord Thax's flagship. Maria received the first communication within seconds. The translation came through with mechanical precision. The voice was harsh and clicking, full of cruel amusement. Warlord Thax demanded that the human ship power down its engines and prepare to be boarded. Resistance would be met with immediate destruction. Compliance might allow some of the crew to survive as slaves or specimens for Krelith scientists. Jake took a deep breath and opened a return channel. He had practiced what to say, keeping his words simple and direct. He informed Warlord Thax that the Horizon's Edge was a peaceful vessel that had accidentally entered Krelith space due to navigational damage. They requested safe passage to leave the area and continue their journey. The response came back quickly, and the translation software captured Warlord Thax's laughter. It was a terrible sound, full of contempt and certainty. The Krelith commander explained that nothing left his territory without his permission. The human ship belonged to the Empire now, and its crew would learn to obey or they would learn to die. Thax gave them 60 seconds to power down before his ships opened fire. Jake looked at Nicole, at Lisa, at Kevin and Peter and Maria and Danny. Each of them nodded, their faces set with determination. He turned back to the communication panel and gave Warlord Thax humanity's answer in 2 simple words: "Come try." The Krelith warships began their attack run. And the first human battle for survival in a hostile galaxy began, the first Krelleth. Plasma bolt hit the forward shields of the Horizon's Edge with enough force to shake the entire bridge. Jake gripped his console as the lights flickered and emergency alarms began wailing throughout the ship. Lisa routed emergency power to the shield generators, buying them precious seconds as the 3 Krelleth warships closed in from different angles. Danny was already moving the massive colony ship in evasive patterns, though calling them evasive was generous given how slowly the Horizon's Edge could maneuver compared to the sleek alien warships. Nicole coordinated the defense from her tactical station, launching the first wave of modified mining drones. Dozens of the small automated units streaked toward the Krelleth ships, their programming altered to seek out engine signatures and detonate on impact. The Krelleth point defense systems destroyed most of them, but 3 got through and slammed into the shields of the nearest warship. The explosions were small, but they proved something important. Humans could hit back. Maria kept the communication channels open, listening to the Krelleth tactical chatter. She heard surprise in their voices as the translation software worked. Warlord Thax was ordering his ships to disable the colony vessel quickly, annoyed that his prey was fighting back. The Krelleth had expected an easy capture, not resistance. Maria passed the information to Jake, who realized they needed to keep surprising the enemy if they had any hope of survival. The mining lasers fired next, their beams designed to cut through solid rock, now targeting Krelleth hull plating. Lisa had overcharged them beyond safe parameters, knowing the emitters would burn out eventually but hoping to do damage first. 2 beams struck the second Krelleth warship, scoring deep cuts along its flank. The alien vessel's shields held, but the attack clearly did more damage than Thax had anticipated. More angry clicking came through the communication channels. Peter worked frantically at the science station, analyzing the sensor data from each Krelleth attack. He noticed patterns in how their weapons fired and how their shields operated. The Krelleth technology was powerful, but it followed predictable cycles. Their shields rotated frequency in a standard sequence, and their weapons needed several seconds to recharge between shots. He fed this information to Nicole, who adjusted their defensive timing accordingly. Jake made a decision that would change everything. They were going to lose this fight eventually unless they changed the rules. He accessed the ship-wide communication system and authorized an emergency wake protocol for all 50,000 colonists. Lisa looked at him in shock, knowing what that meant. The cryo bays would flood with wake-up stimulants, pulling every sleeping human back to consciousness at once. It was dangerous, potentially fatal for some, but they had no choice. Throughout the massive colony ship, cryopods began opening in waves. Confused and disoriented people stumbled out into corridors filled with flashing red lights and blaring alarms. Jake's voice came through every speaker in the ship, explaining in simple terms what was happening. They were under attack by aliens who wanted to enslave or kill them. Humanity needed everyone to fight in whatever way they could. It was a message no one had expected to hear on what was supposed to be a peaceful journey to a new world. The response was chaos at first, but humans adapted quickly. Former factory workers found their way to engineering sections and began following Lisa's instructions to modify systems. Teachers and programmers accessed computer terminals and started looking for ways to disrupt Krelleth boarding procedures. Construction crews grabbed tools and began turning maintenance corridors into defensive positions with improvised barricades and traps. The third Krelleth warship moved in close, preparing to launch boarding pods. Nicole saw it coming and coordinated with Danny to roll the Horizon's Edge at just the right moment. The massive colony ship rotated, presenting fresh shield sections to absorb the plasma fire while positioning their strongest mining laser for a clear shot. Lisa fired it personally, putting every ounce of available power into one sustained beam. The laser burned through the Krelleth shield at its weakest rotation point and carved into the warship's hull. Cutting deep into its internal systems, the alien ship lurched and began venting atmosphere. Its engines sputtered and died, leaving it drifting and helpless. The first Krelleth vessel had been disabled. Maria heard Warlord Thax screaming orders through the communication channels, his earlier amusement replaced by fury. He commanded his remaining 2 ships to destroy the human vessel immediately, forgetting about capture. The humans had drawn blood and now they would pay, but something else was happening that Thax didn't understand. The 50,000 humans were fully awake now and they were getting organized. Greg Fisher, a former police officer, took command of a group of civilians and armed them with cutting torches, pipe wrenches, and anything else that could serve as a weapon. When Krelith boarding pods finally attached to the hull and began cutting through, Greg's teams were waiting on the other side. The Krelith soldiers that poured through the breaches were terrifying to look at, huge insectoid creatures in powered AR. More carrying plasma rifles. But they entered narrow human corridors designed for maintenance access, not combat. Greg's people used the tight spaces to their advantage, venting sections to vacuum, triggering improvised explosives and attacking from unexpected angles. The Krelith had overwhelming firepower, but humans had desperation and cunning, Peter made a breakthrough in his analysis of captured Krelith equipment from the boarding parties. The alien armor had environmental seals that were vulnerable to specific electromagnetic frequencies. He worked with Maria to generate a pulse through the ship's communication arrays. When they activated it, half the Krelith soldiers inside the Horizon's edge found their armor systems failing, their life support cutting out in the oxygen-rich human atmosphere that was toxic to them. Nicole saw an opportunity and took it. She gathered a strike team of Marines and armed civilians, equipped them with sealed environment suits, and led them through an airlock to the outside of the ship. Their goal was audacious. They were going to board the damaged Krelith warship while it was still helpless. Using magnetic boots and maneuvering jets, Nicole's team crossed the void between vessels and cut their way inside. What they found was a nightmare of alien architecture and dying Krelith crew. But they also found something precious. The ship's computer core was still active, full of navigational data and intelligence about the Krelith Empire. Nicole ordered her team to download everything they could carry. If they survived this battle, this information could change everything. Back on the Horizon's Edge bridge, Jake watched as Danny lined up another attack run. The colony ship had taken heavy damage, but it was still fighting. The humans had disabled 1 Krelith warship and were holding their own against boarding parties. Warlord Thax's remaining 2 ships were being more cautious now. Keeping their distance and reassessing their enemy, Maria intercepted a new transmission and her eyes went wide. She told Jake what she was hearing. Thax was calling for reinforcements. Nicole and her team returned to the Horizons, edge-carrying data storage devices filled with Krelith intelligence. The boarding operation had cost them 3 people, but what they brought back was worth the sacrifice. Peter immediately began analyzing the captured information with Kevin's help, and what they discovered was both terrifying and hopeful. The Krelith Empire controlled over 40 star systems and had enslaved or destroyed dozens of alien species. But the data also revealed something the Empire tried to keep secret. There were resistance movements on many of the conquered worlds. Small groups fighting hopeless guerrilla wars against their Krelith overlords. Jake called a meeting with his key people while the battle temporarily paused. Warlord Thax had pulled his remaining 2 ships back to a safer distance, clearly waiting for the reinforcements he had called. The humans had maybe 6 hours before more Krelith warships arrived, and they needed to make a critical decision. Amy Liu joined them, the civilian leader of the colony mission who had been in cryosleep until the emergency wake. She was a businesswoman who had helped organize the entire expedition, and she had strong opinions about what should happen next. Amy argued that they should run. The ship was damaged, but Lisa thought she could get the engines working well enough to limp away from Krelith space. They could find somewhere to hide, repair properly, and continue to their original destination. It was what they had planned. What 50,000 people had signed up for when they left Earth, a new world, a fresh start, away from conflict and war. Amy said they had proven humans could fight if necessary, but they didn't need to keep fighting. This wasn't their war. Jake understood her position, but he disagreed. He showed everyone the data Nicole had captured, the information about enslaved species and brutal oppression across dozens of worlds. If the humans ran now, the Krelith would eventually find them again. The Empire would send more ships, bigger fleets, and next time humanity might not be so lucky. More than that, Jake argued, they had just proven something important to the entire galaxy. The Krellith could be beaten. That message was already spreading through the underground. Networks of rebel groups on conquered worlds. Maria had been monitoring those networks since discovering them in the captured data. She showed the group dozens of transmissions from enslaved aliens, who had somehow heard about the human ship that fought back against a Krellith patrol fleet. The impossible had happened, and people across multiple star systems were talking about it. Some messages were hopeful, asking if the humans would help. Others were warnings, telling the strange newcomers to flee while they could because the Empire's revenge would be terrible. Peter added his analysis of Krellith technology and tactics. The Empire was powerful, but it had grown complacent over generations of easy victories. Their weapons were standardized, their strategies predictable, and they hadn't innovated in decades because no one had forced them to. Human creativity and adaptability could be a genuine advantage if they chose to keep fighting. The Krellith expected obedience and fear, not resistance and clever tactics. The discussion went on for 2 hours while Lisa's engineering teams worked to repair damage and Danny's pilots prepared for another battle. Finally, Jake called for a vote among the command staff, knowing this decision was too important for him to make alone. Amy and 3 others voted to run. Jake, Nicole, Peter, Maria, Danny, and 4 more voted to stay and fight. The group was divided, but the majority had spoken. Jake then did something unprecedented. He opened a ship-wide channel and explained the situation to all 50,000 colonists. He told them about the Krellith Empire, about the enslaved species, and about the choice they faced: run to safety or stay and fight for others. He made it clear this wasn't a military order. Every person aboard would get to vote. The decision would take an hour to tally, and whatever the majority chose, they would all follow. The wait was agonizing. Jake stood on the bridge watching the tactical display where Warlord Thax's 2 remaining ships maintained their distance. The Krellith commander was being patient now, learning from his earlier mistakes. He wouldn't underestimate the humans again. Maria reported that the reinforcements were still hours away, a full battle group of 10 additional warships. If the humans were going to run, they needed to decide soon. The vote results came back, and Jake felt his heart pound as he read them. 32,000 people voted to stay and fight. 18,000 voted to run. The margin was clear. Humanity had chosen to stand against the Krellith Empire. Amy Lou accepted the result with grace even though she disagreed. She told Jake that if they were staying, then they needed a real plan because brave defiance wouldn't be enough against what was coming. She was right. Jake, Nicole, and Amy worked together to create a strategy that used everything they had learned. Peter's team would continue analyzing Krellith weaknesses and developing countermeasures. Lisa's engineers would turn the Horizon's Edge into a proper warship, using both human ingenuity and captured alien technology. Maria would reach out to the resistance networks on enslaved worlds and coordinate with them. Danny would train pilots to work with whatever ships they could acquire, but first they needed to deal with Warlord Thax. Nicole proposed capturing the Krellith commander alive. The psychological impact of a human victory would be amplified if the aliens saw one of their warlords taken prisoner. It would prove the Empire wasn't invincible. Jake approved the plan and Nicole began organizing her strike teams. Maria made contact with the nearest enslaved world, a planet called Vora located 2 star systems away. The Vorans were a reptilian species that had been fighting the Krellith for 20 years. Their rebellion had been slowly crushed into small, scattered cells that could barely survive, let alone threaten their occupiers. But when Maria's transmission reached them, explaining that humans had just disabled a Krellith warship and were preparing to fight more, the Voran response was immediate and emotional. They wanted to help. They wanted to believe. Steve Jackson volunteered to lead a small team to Vora in one of the Horizon's Edge shuttles. It was a dangerous mission, but if they could make direct contact with the Voran resistance, they might be able to coordinate attacks across multiple systems. The Krellith Empire was vast, but it couldn't be everywhere at once. If rebellions ignited simultaneously on several worlds, the Empire's forces would be divided. Jake approved Steve's mission and watched as the shuttle departed. Then he turned his attention back to the immediate threat. Thax's reinforcements would arrive in 4 hours. The humans needed to finish this first battle decisively before the odds became impossible. He ordered Danny to begin a new attack pattern, one designed to force the remaining Kralith warships closer to the disabled vessel where Nicole's teams were waiting. The Horizon's Edge began moving, still battered but far from beaten. The colony ship that was supposed to carry sleeping humans to a peaceful new world had become something else. It was now the flagship of a rebellion that didn't even know it existed yet. Jake stood on the bridge surrounded by people who had been civilians just hours ago, now working tactical stations and weapons controls with desperate determination. Peter called out a warning. The disabled Krelith warship was powering up its self-destruct sequence. Thax was going to destroy it rather than let the humans capture more intelligence or use it against him. Nicole's teams barely made it back to the Horizon's Edge before the alien vessel exploded in a flash of white light. Jake smiled grimly. Thax had just told them something important. The Krelith commander was afraid. The 2 weeks that followed were the most intense of Jake's life. Every hour mattered as the humans prepared for what was coming. Lisa's engineering teams worked around the clock transforming the Horizon's Edge from a colony ship into something that could fight a real war. They stripped non-essential sections for materials, rebuilt the weapon systems with hybrid human and Krylith technology, and reinforced the hull where they could. The mining lasers were replaced with proper military-grade weapons salvaged from the destroyed Krylith warship before it exploded. Steve Jackson returned from Vora with incredible news. The Vorons had agreed to join them, and they weren't alone. Word of the human resistance had spread faster than anyone expected through the underground networks. 3 other enslaved species sent representatives to meet with Jake. The Cylon were an aquatic people who had been conquered 15 years ago. The Draken were fierce warriors whose homeworld had fallen to the Krelith a decade past. Even some of the Turthos, a species of peaceful scholars, wanted to fight after generations of slavery. Nicole trained the mixed species combat teams that began forming. Humans taught the aliens tactics they had developed fighting each other back on Earth. The Vorons showed humans how to move silently through hostile territory. The Drakens shared their knowledge of close-quarters combat. It was strange and wonderful watching different species learn from each other. United by a common enemy and a shared desire for freedom, Danny worked with alien pilots to develop entirely new methods of space combat. The Krelith flew in rigid formations that never changed. Danny taught the Coalition forces to fly chaotically, to break apart and reform, to attack from unexpected angles. They practiced with the handful of ships the Resistance had managed to steal or build in secret over the years. It wasn't much of a fleet, but combined with the Horizon's Edge and human creativity, it might be enough. Maria became the voice of the Coalition, broadcasting messages of hope to enslaved worlds across Krelith space. She was careful with her words, knowing that the Empire monitored communications. But she found ways to reach the people who needed to hear. Small phrases in old languages, mathematical sequences that meant nothing to Krelith, but everything to those who had been waiting for a signal to rise up. The rebellion was growing and the Empire was starting to notice. Peter developed weapons specifically designed to exploit Krelith weaknesses. Their armor was strong, but it relied on environmental seals that could be disrupted. Their ships had powerful shields, but those shields cycled in predictable patterns. Most importantly, the Krelith themselves were psychologically vulnerable. They had ruled through fear for so long that they didn't know how to handle an enemy that refused to be afraid. Fleet Commander Zrath arrived exactly 2 weeks after Warlord Thax had first attacked the Horizon's Edge. He brought 30 warships, a force large enough to destroy entire planets. The Krelith commander expected to find the remnants of a single, damaged colony ship and whatever primitive resistance Thax had encountered. What he found instead was a coalition fleet of 37 vessels from 5 different species, all flying in coordinated formations that the Krelith had never seen before. Jake stood on the bridge of the horizon's edge watching the enemy fleet arrive. Beside him stood representatives from each species in the coalition. The Varan commander named Sharesh, the Silent leader called Wavesinger, the Draken warrior Crag, and the Turthos scholar Mindweaver. They had all agreed that this battle would determine the future of the entire region. If they won, rebellions would explode across a dozen worlds. If they lost, the Krelith would make examples of them all. Srath's opening communication was full of arrogant confidence. He demanded immediate surrender and promised that his mercy would be swift deaths for the leaders. Everyone else would face long torture as punishment for daring to resist the Empire. Maria translated the message for the coalition forces, and Jake heard anger in the voices of every species present. They had all suffered under Krelith rule. This was their chance to strike back. The battle began with the coalition fleet splitting into small groups, each moving independently just as Danny had trained them. The Krelith warships tried to maintain their traditional formations, but the chaos of multiple, small attacks from different directions disrupted their coordination. Human ships armed with modified weapons targeted the cycling shields at their weakest points. Varan fighters used their superior maneuverability to slip through defensive fire. Draken warriors piloted attack craft with suicidal bravery, ramming damaged Krelith vessels. Nicole led boarding parties that mixed human marines with alien fighters. They used Peter's electromagnetic weapons to disable Krelith armor and then overwhelmed the enemy soldiers with superior numbers and tactics. Each captured ship was turned against the Empire, its weapons firing on former allies. The psychological impact was devastating to Krelith morale. Maria coordinated with resistance cells across 6 different star systems. As the space battle raged, rebellions ignited on enslaved worlds. Weapons caches that had been hidden for years were uncovered. Saboteurs struck at Krelith supply lines. Whole cities rose up against their occupiers. The Empire's forces were suddenly fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously, and they had no experience with this kind of distributed warfare. Danny led a squadron of mixed human and alien fighters on a desperate attack run against Zrath's flagship. The Krelith commander had positioned himself in the center of his formation, protected by layers of escorts and defensive screens. But Danny saw a weakness in the pattern. He led his squadron through a gap in the formation, taking heavy casualties but opening a path. Then he did something no sane pilot would attempt. He flew directly through a Krelith weapons platform, using his ship's shields to punch a hole through the structure before ejecting at the last second. The weapons platform exploded, and the gap it created allowed the rest of the coalition fleet to pour through. Suddenly, Zrath's flagship was exposed and vulnerable. The horizon's edge, scarred and battered, but still fighting, moved in with every weapon firing. Lisa had saved one surprise for this moment. She had converted the colony ship's main drive into a massive directed energy weapon, something that could only be fired once, before burning out completely, but would hit with devastating force. Jake gave the order and Lisa fired. The beam struck Zrath's flagship dead center, punching through shields and armor and coring the vessel like an apple. The Krelith commander's ship began breaking apart, its structure failing catastrophically. The rest of the Krelith fleet watched their leader die, and something broke in their formation. Ships began breaking away, retreating in disorder. Fleet Commander Zrath had become the first Krelith commander in generations to lose a major battle, and he hadn't even survived to face the shame. The coalition fleet pursued the retreating Krelith warships, but Jake called them back. They had won this battle, but the war was just beginning. The Empire would send more fleets, and the coalition needed time to prepare. Messages were already arriving from enslaved worlds reporting successful uprisings. 18 different planets had declared independence in the chaos following the battle. The galaxy was changing. 3 days after the victory, Jake stood in what had become the command center of the Free Coalition. That was what the other species were calling their alliance, and the name had stuck. Amy Lou approached him with news both good and concerning. 5,000 colonists wanted to continue to their original destination, to build the peaceful colony they had planned. The rest wanted to stay and fight for a free galaxy. Jake approved the decision. A convoy of ships would escort the colonists to their new world, protected by coalition forces. But he and 30,000 other humans would remain here. Nicole stood beside him along with Lisa, Kevin, Peter, Maria, and Danny. They had all chosen to stay. Around them were Vorans and Cylon and Draken, and Turthos and representatives from a dozen other species, who had heard about the victory and wanted to join. Maria sent out a final broadcast that would reach every corner of Krelith-controlled space. Her message was simple and powerful. She identified the coalition species and made a promise to everyone listening. They were human and Voran and Cylon and Draken and free. The Krelith had terrorized the galaxy for generations, but they had made one fatal mistake. They had fired on humanity's ark and awakened something they couldn't control. The Empire's reign of terror was ending and the Free Coalition was just beginning. Jake looked at the view screen showing dozens of ships from different worlds, all waiting for orders. He had never wanted to be a revolutionary, but the galaxy needed someone to stand up to the Krelith. Humanity had woken from cryo-sleep expecting a peaceful journey and found a war instead. Now they would finish what the Empire had started.